Welcome back to part two of the worldie unboxed episode featuring David Gonzalez, the founder of Fizzy THC. In this segment, Aaron and I break down the insights from our conversation with David, exploring the surprising similarities between his brand and ours. We'll also dive into what it takes to build a unique, disruptive product and how those lessons resonate with our own journey at Worldie. Thanks for being a part of the Worldie community. Don't forget to visit worldiebrand.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more highlights. All right, let's get started.
You want to start? Let's start with your first question because I think that's a good intro.
Yeah, no, I was kind of like when I was listening to him, because I was, at the IJ clinic, Institute for Justice clinic, was working with a client who was, they were doing like a hemp derived THC product as well, products, because they had a whole line of like uh, ingestibles, um, tinctures, and creams and stuff like that. And they were wanting to also participate in e-commerce, so interstate commerce. And so it was kind of like, I mean, it was a little bit different because we weren't really like involved in her marketing strategy, but we were trying to provide her legal guidance when it came to making kind of claims because hers is, the health benefits of hemp-derived THC. And so it was kind of interesting hearing him talk about a lot of the things that we had to kind of coach her through. So that it brought back a bit of nostalgia, I guess, and then also some bells start ringing as like, oh yeah, I do remember COAs and things like that, and making sure that um, we got independent certification for the THC that's being put into her product. So it was interesting hearing him talk about things like the Farm Bill and things like that. So yeah, we can jump into this kind of first question. Um, it was it feels weird as a kid's product talking to um I guess now it's being a little bit more legalized nationally, at least state by state, and maybe not as frowned upon in certain areas anymore, but it still kind of feels like a bit weird talking to a cannabis derived product founder, and us being like a kid shoe brand. There seems to still be like a little bit of weirdness, but outside of that, I thought there were a bunch of like similarities between our vastly different products. Uh, were you able to kind of like identify any type of like similarities between us and maybe even just David's approach?
I think mainly it was the approach. I was thinking about kind of similarities between our product and his, and I couldn't really think of many, if any. But in terms of the approach, I think the thing that really resonated with me that he was talking about was patience. So building slowly, making sure to really focus on differentiation, not necessarily just wanting to be acquired at the first point, really wanting to take a shot himself and build up his own brand. And then if that didn't work out, then he would look into white labeling, licensing, or selling the formulation to kind of a bigger company. So I think patience is the big one. I mean, also just being, I know he's not really an outsider the same way that we are, but I think he still has that outsider mentality, and he's being viewed as a smaller guy in a pretty, I mean, the exact space that he plays in, it's depends how you want to define it, whether that's THC, whether it's cannabis, or kind of like drinks that make you feel good. Those are all, pretty big markets, and there's a lot of demand. So I think there's some pretty big players looking at those spaces, but they can't necessarily either do what he did, or they don't necessarily want to take the risks with kind of like advertising, doing these things that are potentially legally questionable, right? So I think that's
Mhm.
actually a difference between him and us, where we're playing in a space where there's really no risk of a Nike and Adidas, whoever it is, to focus on kids' shoes. They just don't necessarily do it as much as we want to, just because it's not as profitable as other types of shoes that they can make. But what were you thinking about some of the similarities that you saw?
Yeah, I definitely noticed that like patience in terms of um, something that we've kind of done with our own product, our own approach. But one of the things that I noticed between our products, I like it's very hard to find similarities between the two products. But I thought that when he started talking about it being more of a gateway to like THC, especially for people who are either unfamiliar with THC or they've had potentially like bad experiences in the past with THC. This gives you an opportunity to to have some of the benefits with a lower dosage of it. And how that fit into like our product model is we we kind of give parents and kids an opportunity um, to dabble or to it's like a gateway to sports. So now our product allows them to do it, and our low dosage is you don't have to go off on the deep end and buy a whole bunch of sport specific cleats. You can just use this one shoe, and it allows you to try a litany of different sports and figure out which one kind of works for you. The same thing with like him and THC, like it gives you an opportunity to try a certain percentage and figure out what kind of works for you. And so it may be a bit of a stretch, but like I was like, okay, there is a similarity between our products that like went unnoticed, at least by me at the very beginning. But as he began to speak about it, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a similar style of like product that we're trying to kind of like uh I guess create. So that was what I was that's what I kind of noticed between the two products outside or beyond the approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that idea of our shoes as kind of a gateway to sports. I think that's a fun idea. And then this is something that we both kind of noticed, but David was saying that there's some, when we were talking about the demographics of his customer base, he mentioned, I want to say millennials, like millennial women, then maybe he mentioned Gen Z, and then he said the unexpected group that's really liked his product is boomers, and how I think someone bought it at an old folks home and then kind of passed it around to all their friends. And then one of them came up
Crush
to,
it up in some
yeah,
applesauce.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Going hard.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think there's either consumer segments or product uses that we're potentially overlooking that could really enjoy our product?
Yeah, I kind of had a similar question for you. So I guess my answer to that is, yeah, I do see it being used in a way that we didn't necessarily plan for. And so I know right now we're really focused on the product in general, but we're also focused on the aesthetics. Like we're really focused on making sure that the shoe like looks like something that we're proud of. And I think that type of effort, that type of intentionality will create a product that we're very pleased with. And I think it'll create a product that resonates with a lot of people. And not to say that it's going to be some kind of like fashion statement type shoe, but I could see it being like potentially down the road if there was some way that it was going to be used outside of what we were anticipating, then potentially it could be used as like some kind of fashion item, like some kind of item that people just wear for its aesthetic like appeal as opposed to like the functionality that we actually are trying to develop the shoe for. So maybe that's one of the ways in which I see the shoe being used um, that we're not like really intending for it to be used. So I don't know. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what I was thinking is, and we talked about this a little bit before, but we're designing this thing to work really well across a lot of different playing surfaces, but there's a chance that it works really well on, two or three playing surfaces. So if it ends up working really well on, let's say, turf and courts, but not great on grass, then maybe there's some kind of sport that is played year round that's on turf and courts that maybe we're not thinking about, and it almost becomes like, it's a multi-purpose shoe, but people who play that sport really like it, and it almost becomes like the best shoe for kids playing the sport. So I think we think a lot about, okay, soccer, football, basketball, all these different sports, but maybe it's like gymnastics or something, like, some sport that we're not necessarily thinking about, and it just becomes really well adopted by parents of kids who play that one sport.
Yeah. I think we may have like talked about it a long, long time ago. Like, oh, what if it becomes like a pickleball shoe or something that like we weren't intending it to be? So yeah, I could definitely see it becoming um a shoe that's really good for a particular sport, and like a lot of people who play that particular sport end up like getting that shoe for that reason.
Then you wanted
Um,
to ask the related question that you had.
yeah. So like uh David mentioned getting the THC on an airplane, getting the fizzies on an airplane, and then also getting the fizzies at a Vikings game. I mean, obviously our products aren't like, same in that regards where you gotta have to sneak it in somewhere. But do you see or do you envision like the product being in an environment in maybe an unexpected environment, like something that we didn't envision? And this is very similar to the question that you just asked.
Yeah. So we ran few surveys about almost a year ago at this point. I think it was like 300 or 400 responses. And we asked a bunch of questions. And one of the questions was, when you hear multi-purpose kids athletic shoe, what kind of sports do you think? And we listed maybe like 6 or 7 different sports and had people tick each box that they thought it would work for. And then one of the most surprising results of that survey in general was that a lot of people thought multi-purpose, multi-surface, or all-purpose, it means that it's going to work for hiking and trail running, but not necessarily sports like soccer. So I think one of the unexpected applications, especially if the shoe is super durable, is hike like vacations, right? So you take your kid to a national park or state park, or just, whatever local park, and they need something that's durable, that provides support, that's an athletic shoe. So maybe we see a lot of parents do that, instead of necessarily saying, okay, this is a sport specific shoe. This is really an all purpose outdoor shoe. So I think that's maybe something that we're not anticipating, that we could see people using it in that scenario.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And my answer is I mean, it's pretty much the same the same response to your question. It becoming more of a lifestyle shoe as opposed to like, just utilized for sports. It's something that's kind of like the everyday shoe that, kids end up wearing in a plethora of different places. And perhaps it's like aesthetic appeal. So, yeah, that checks with me.
Then I have actually a similar question. This is like a chain of similarities, but
Yeah.
on the same point where David was talking about sneaking his product past TSA, and then, taking it on a plane or sneaking into the Vikings game. He mentioned that he filmed those both, and that they were they almost went viral, I think on Instagram, he said. So do you think there's any way for us to do something similar as a commercial, as something on social media, and to go viral, kind of like he did?
I mean, I definitely think there's an opportunity to go viral, especially as we like start producing and sending out this type of content. And then as we get like user generated content, yeah, there's going to be some scenarios in which like people might be using the product in a different way in which we're like branding or marketing it for. So I can see it happening. Can I think of the exact scenario or an example of an exact scenario? Um, Maybe not, and that's probably a good thing. I want it to kind of be like a surprising. I want it to be something that I'm like, oh wow, our community are coming up with like concepts or ways to use it that we just didn't even like consider. And so, do I think about like a an exact way in which this product can be used? Yeah. Do I think about like ways in which like consumers might use it? I try, but I don't think I can like come up with some example that specifically like I guess responds to that particular question. I don't know what do you have something in mind? Do you have a scenario in which you would see the shoe that that's similar to what with David's like Viking or
Yeah.
plane?
I think it's not the same kind of product where if you take a shoe somewhere it's not supposed to be, it's just not as there's not that level of risk or like, oh, that's pretty funny, right? Like when I was talking to David about potentially like, things that you could put on social media, I was saying like, okay, maybe you're a groom at a wedding and then you go off for a little bit and then secretly, drop this in your drink, or you're at work and you're having a rough day, you go into the bathroom and drink this or whatever, or even you're like in a meeting and then you just take out some mints and they're THC mints and you relax. I don't think there's that same type of like humorous way you can go about doing things with shoes just because they're not taboo at all. Like if you put on shoes, that's normal. Like you do that everywhere. So I was thinking maybe something with, and we'd have to be careful about this, but parody and satire. And one of the ideas I had is a commercial where you're bleeping out a word like fun or something. And then you reveal at the end that the word that was being bleeped was fun. And then maybe you thought it was an actual bad word the whole time. And then you realize it's a kid's product. I think that could be funny and unexpected. But at the same time, I think if you're in the kid space, you kind of have to be careful about using or implying that you're using bad words. So that's one of the ideas I had, but I just don't know if that would resonate or not.
Yeah, no, I think that would be kind of funny, especially if we're kind of that type of content would go out to like parents. Like we've kind of like talked about that. Parents, not necessarily kids, would be the ones who'd be like consuming that content. So I could see that working. And also when you mentioned like a taboo place for shoes, it just I just thought about like you remember the other day I was telling you that I'm taking the girls to go to the indoor like jumping place is what they call it, but it's like a place where you go and you there's a bunch of bounce houses, a bunch of different like inflatables and things like that that you can kind of jump on or whatnot. And immediately they kind of tell you that you can't wear shoes. You have to have like their socks as well. Like they have their particular socks. Perhaps there's a situation where, a kid like sneaks in, the shoe and actually jumps on it at one of the bouncy castles or one of the obstacle courses or things like that. So that may be a taboo spot, and that could be a certain like user generated content that is in line with David sneaking fizzies on an airplane or in a Vikings game.
Yeah, and that inspired another idea. So you could have, a parent, so mom or dad, in a house, and they're kind of like cleaning it all. They're cleaning the floors, everything looks pristine, and then the kid comes in and doesn't take their shoes off, and then you see maybe like grass, you see mud, you see those little black things from turf fields, you see like a bunch of different things that indicate the kid has played on a lot of different surfaces and been a lot of different places, and the parent is just getting madder and madder and like, how many places were you going with these shoes on, things like that, and that kind of highlights that it's one shoe for everything. So I think that could work too. But I mean, I think these would be expensive commercials to film. So maybe
No,
not in the near
I like
future.
that. I like that. I think it gets the message across, and then it also like it's in right on brand with what parents experience all the time with their kids, like treading in like dirt or debris or whatever it is and messing up environments. But this time it's them having played in these way different environments in this one product. So yeah, I like that. I like
Yeah.
that a lot.
And then, I mean, this is another kind of like trope in commercials, but you could have the parent be like, you weren't supposed to wear that across all those different surfaces. You've ruined them now. And then the kid is like, oh no, these are worldie shoes. They work across all different, surfaces. And then they go into that long spiel. And then the parent's like, oh, okay, that's great.
No, yeah, that would be maybe a whole lot for like a 4 or 5 year old to
I
come up
know.
with. But yeah,
Yeah, I was
at
thinking
least the four or
scripts.
5 year olds
Yeah.
I've have experience
I
with.
was thinking scripted, not UGC, and then yeah, like some kind of talented acting 4 to 5 year old. But
Yeah, definitely it'd have to be one with a little bit of talent because the 4 or 5 year olds that I'm around, yeah, they wouldn't just come up with that off the top of the dome.
no, definitely not. That would be part of the humor of it.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I know David talked a lot about like trends and things like that, especially trends concerning these THC drinks or CBD drinks. How do we avoid being like these like one-off trends or this or fad?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's something that we kind of have to think a little bit more about and maybe study some other brands that were trends or fads and understand why they weren't able to build off that. So one of the things that I keep seeing on social media and just in general is the Stanley Cup. Have you seen that? That
Yeah, yeah, I've
huge
seen
cup
that.
and how they pivoted and focused on, I want to say, Gen Z and millennial women. And now it's just kind of like the it cup. And I think before it was for construction workers or something. And I keep seeing people praise that brand, but at the same time, I'm thinking that's probably just going to be a fad. Like there was a water bottle that was super popular with Gen Z women like a couple years ago, and then a different one a couple years before that. So I think for us, it's maybe it's like not going. Well, I guess it's like not focusing on a really broad demographic, like okay, all parents aged 35 to 45, but instead really thinking about our target segment and what they like, what their kids like, what they value, and really focusing on delivering on those values versus just being some kind of cool shoe that that people want to try out. And I think also with shoes, especially kid shoes, if they're durable, if they do everything that they say they're going to do, and if they make a parent's life easier, there's really no reason for them to want to switch brands. So I think if you get all these things right, there will be brand loyalty. But if you're just selling based on style and there's really no differentiation, then that's when you risk just being a trend or a fad.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the ways, and I could definitely be wrong with this, to not prevent, but to at least like mitigate the impact of being considered a trend or fad is to have it fit into your story. So like if a brand is a story, if like that's like behind the brand, then it has to make sense. Like it has to be a congruent piece of the story and not some kind of like outlier. And you can't be like grasping for straws. It has to be like a natural progression of the brand, I feel like. I it was brought up during the conversation with David, Allbirds, and how Allbirds has kind of gotten off course. And they had this specific story that they started off with, and it was really good. It really resonated with their target community, and it really took off. And I didn't think at the time it was just going to be like a trend, but because they kind of went away from their story, or it became like an unbelievable aspect of their story, like they started to do something totally different. I think they started to lose a little bit of that luster. And I think that's kind of a good case study for us to kind of like make sure that our story is cohesive and the message is clear, and that anything that we do next is like it is seen as like a natural progression of it. Like it doesn't confuse, it doesn't like, oh wow, they're just grasping for straws here or whatever. It doesn't seem like a desperate attempt to like capture some like uh trend or fad that's going on. It's all about like staying true to the narrative that we kind of are creating right now. And so I think that may be a way to mitigate. It's really hard to not, if you want to be successful, because you want to go viral. You want people to really like it and you want it to like catch fire, but you want it to catch fire in a way that is long lasting. And that's all about having like a real central story and being able to naturally grow from that story as opposed to like just reaching for anything that like seems to be trendy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And what I would say is one way to avoid being a fad is by not chasing fads. So I think that's kind of what you were just saying, right? So I know we talked a little bit about pickleball already, but like let's say we launch in 6 months to a year and then we're pretty successful and then High starts taking off in the US. Like a lot of people don't even know what that is, right? But if we're like, oh, High is like growing really fast, there's not really a High shoe in the US, like, why don't we just do a highlight shoe? And then if people saw that, they'd be like, how does this, how does highlight kind of fit into the worldie brand? They're, multi-sport, multi-purpose. And then they're like, oh, they're just trying to do whatever they can to jump on this wave of highlight. So I think you're right that we just got to focus on what matters to us. And even if there's these new lucrative opportunities, if it doesn't fit with, our values, our mission, and really what we stand for already to customers, then it'll just be confusing rather than something that customers will just readily buy.
Yep. No, I think that's well said. Definitely agree with that.
And then on competition, I have a few kind of questions related to competition and differentiation. But one of the things I thought was pretty interesting about David's product is that he has all this competition in theory, but really he's a complement rather than a substitute to those
Hmm.
products, right? Because you could just put his product into any drink and make it, I don't want to say better, but more effective, like, more efficacious, whatever the word is. So do you see or foresee any scenario where we become a complement rather than a substitute to some of these bigger athletic shoe brands?
Yeah, I think the way in which we're postured already, we're kind of postured to be a complement. I know that for a certain segment, we're hoping to be a substitute, but then as our the age segment that we're really like focused on gets older, as that group of individuals gets older, we're anticipating them going to more specialized shoes. And in that case, what we've actually done is, and this going back to like that whole gateway question that we had, we've introduced a lot of people to the sport who might not necessarily have been introduced to it. And now they've gotten good at that sport and they want something that is sport specific, and now they're going to these bigger brands and they're actually like purchasing their cleats, purchasing their gear in order to now compete at a very high level or a higher level at that particular sport. So I see it as being a compliment because now we're just creating a bigger pool for them to kind of like dip out of. And so yeah, it's a compliment in that sense. And what is, I don't think that they're going to stop making shoes for kids or specific cleats for kids in like the age group that we're like creating our product for. So I feel like it's always going to be a substitute in that segment. But what we're actually doing is we're creating a bigger pool, hopefully if we're successful, for those kids, those young athletes to actually be customers of those bigger brands.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I hadn't necessarily thought about this before, but now that we're talking, it just came to mind. But we've talked a little bit about modularity in the past. So one shoe, but different soles or some kind of thing that you're putting on the sole to make them effective across all these different surfaces, especially as you get older and maybe you need something that's a bit more surface specific. So I was thinking, and I'm not saying that we would do this ever, but you could foresee some company being almost like a sole add-on for Nikes or Adidas. You buy like a flat shoe and then you use that same shoe on courts, but then if you go to turf, you add this thing on top of the sole that has a little bit of more traction. And then if you're going to grass, you take that off, you put something on that's a bit more aggressive. So that's an idea of how someone could be more of a complement than a substitute. But I think that might add more complication rather than ease to parents' lives because then they have to keep track of all these different modular soles. They have to put them on, take them off, hope that their kid doesn't break them, I guess, if they try to take them off their themselves or lose them. So that's an idea, but I don't necessarily know if it would actually make our target customers' life any easier. So I don't think it necessarily makes sense unless we hear from people that that's something that they want.
Yeah, I could see that being a bit difficult simply because it could be potentially a little bit more cumbersome, like a more time-consuming process than we would want our target consumers to kind of like have to go through. But yeah, I've seen products like that actually work out. Like there's a product, I believe it's called like Playmaker, and you connect it to a cleat, and it has like I think it's like a tech product too because it gives you analytics on how you're performing on like the soccer field or pitch or whatever.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think there are some like, I mean, it's not a direct like comparison, but there are some like substitutes out there, or not substitutes. There are some complementary brands out there that work for like those big brand products. So I could see that being, and I don't know an exact example for us outside of what you've kind of already given, but yeah, I could potentially see some type of like complementary symbiotic relationship that like a brand like Playmaker has with, these large soccer cleat manufacturers.
And then a similar question. So if we can't, not if we can't, but if we're not going to be a complement rather than a substitute, do you think there's any way for us to try to compete where other big companies are not really competing, or in areas that they don't necessarily care as much about defending their market share there?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that we're building and developing a shoe specifically for this age segment that kind of gets overlooked. We've heard a number of times now of like the takedown market or the shrink it and pink it strategy. I think they're they are kind of getting overlooked at this point, and so that's really like what comes to mind initially in terms of where else we could be that is getting like overlooked. I don't know, that's a tough one. I'm gonna throw it back at you. Like the first thing that I said was probably the thing that like presented itself. I can't think of another.
I think, I mean, a lot of people, I don't know if you get the same feedback, but whenever I explain the idea to people, they're always kind of like, oh, that's a niche idea, or that's a niche market. And I think there's pros and cons to that, right? So the fact that it is pretty specific in terms of what we're going after, it's kids in a very specific age range that want to play a lot of different sports, stay active, and do so across a lot of different surfaces. And then also their parents are willing to send them out to all those different sports or activities in one shoe. So I think the fact that it's so niche, it's kind of like, okay, another shoe brand could copy us, but if they do that, then it just looks like they're copying. And people who know us would probably prefer us because they're like, these are the guys that did it first. Their whole brand is built around it. But then if we start expanding into sport specific footwear, then I think that's the that would be the time where then the other brands start to take notice and they say, they're starting to encroach on really our bread and butter. So let's go after these guys. So I think it's almost like not staying small, but staying really focused on this initial target segment for a long period of time, really delivering a lot of value and potentially expanding in terms of products that we can offer them, instead of saying, okay, this first footwear product was with this initial target segment was successful. Let's go younger and let's go older with these shoes. I think it's, instead of that, it's okay, these shoes with this target range was successful. Let's do more products for this target range. So I think that's one way you can do it. But other than that, I don't have any really good answer to that question. I was just curious because it seems like David has done a really good job of not stepping on any toes or really competing against some of these bigger companies, but instead building something that they would want to buy or license or whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good answer. And it may be a bit different than like David's experience in that particular industry because though it's established, it's not nearly as established as the footwear industry. And so it's not like it's something that's been around for forever. It's something that's kind of or relatively new. So it's easier to kind of like develop your niche a bit more and kind of do it without stepping on a lot of toes where we're going into an industry where regardless of where we where we walk or where we go, we're going to be stepping on toes.
Yeah, there's toes everywhere where we're
Toes
where
everywhere.
where we're building. And then last question I had for you on this kind of like competition piece is, and bear with me because this might be like a kind of weird way to put this, but David, he built a competitive moat that
Hmm.
gives him a decent amount of optionality, right? So he has a patent pending formulation. No one else has been able to figure it out. And then now he has options in terms of where he can go from here. He can build his own brand, he can license the product, he could sell the technology or the company in general. So do you think there's any way for us to build in a similar way where we do something that is so valuable that we have all these different paths that we can go in? Or do you think the footwear industry is just not the same, so we can't really do that?
First, yeah, I think the footwear industry is not the same, so it would be a maybe a lot more difficult to kind of like create this like competitive moat. But there are ways in which we can kind of go about like, and we talked about differentiation. We talked about being like the first mover, and so kind of having that first mover advantage in a particular like niche area of the footwear industry. And I think what we're doing lends itself to all that. Also, just having like this story, like that, the story of the brand itself kind of like creates this competitive moat because other companies wouldn't be able to duplicate it without, we've already kind of mentioned this, blatantly looking like they just copied us. So I think that kind of creates a bit of a competitive moat that we can kind of use and build from that story because that story is going to be unique to us in order to be able to create products, brand and market products. So like I think that's one of the ways in which we can kind of like build a competitive mode. And then the fact that we're focused solely, and I really like your response to that earlier question about being like really focused on this segment as opposed to trying to expand to capture a younger or older age demographic. I think being very, very narrowly focused on this segment, at least for a while, really kind of benefits us because then we're more or less seen as the experts in this particular area, and that type of credibility will lend itself well as we try to develop other products or to expand that product line that we're already kind of building upon. So different than what David is doing, but because it's two totally different industries, but there are some ways in which we can kind of build a competitive moat around us.
I just thought of a pretty good example. It's not exactly one to one, but an example of a company that built that competitive moat that gives them that optionality. It's Kizik. So, hands-free shoes, shoes that you basically step on the back of them and
Hmm.
then they fold down and then your foot slips in and then they kind of fold back up. And when you do that, you give yourself the opportunity to sell your own shoes or to sell that technology or license it. And I think they definitely sell their own shoes. And I want to say they've licensed the technology to some other companies as well. So I was thinking for us what that could be. And it could be like if we get really good at creating, um, tread patterns or creating these aspects that make it really easy to put on and take off the shoe for a kid, then potentially we could start licensing that technology. I don't think we would want to unless we just were so bad at selling our own shoes that it became almost like, okay, we can't, the shoe business thing isn't working. Like, let's tackle this in a different way. So that's one way you could potentially, if we just like patented tread patterns and then patented other aspects of the shoe. That's one way where you build a moat and it gives you kind of optionality. But I would think the optionality is almost like it's there's a priority, right? So it's most lucrative probably to sell your own shoes, and then if that doesn't work, then you go to something else. So I don't think, like I said before, it's not one to one to what David is thinking about, but it's still decent comp, I think, within our industry.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good comp. That's a good example of how you could do it in our industry. And I think Kizik has done a good job of like creating something that is patentable. And perhaps down the road we'd be doing the same. What, the potential is there for us to do something very similar. So yeah, I agree with that. Uh, n- another like piece of the conversation with David was how they became, and we've already kind of mentioned it in several of our answers, like very focused. Sometimes to like their detriment, they didn't think about like other things that they could have added to their product in order to make it even better than what it is right now. And he started talking also about like shiny balls, like just like being uh, distracted or whatever by these other things that are popping up that they could kind of go after, but kind of like being focused on this like one thing and getting really good at it. Do you recognize any like shiny balls that have come up already for us on our venture journey?
I think there's been a lot. So I think the main one so far has been footwear scanning.
Yeah, yeah,
Just
yeah.
because it's so hard to actually get that done. And I think there would be value to it, right? But it's just probably because if we do that, if we tried to build that in-house, then it's essentially like building a product and a software at the same time, which for two of us is just a lot and it's probably going to cost a lot of money. I think the other one, which we've gotten this out of our system, at least for now, is 3D printing. So when we first started out, we were like so gung ho about 3D printing and basically saying this is the only way, this is the future. We need to jump on this before other people realize this is the future of footwear. And it was just kind of not quite a dead end, but it just wasn't really going to work for our product right now. And then I think also team has been somewhat of a shiny ball because been a couple times where we're like, oh, we really need to add this specific team member, or we really need to give this person equity and make them a full-time member of the team. And then as we've gone forward and, kept working on it, we're kind of like, oh yeah, that person wouldn't have been a good fit, or I'm really glad that we didn't offer that person equity, or that wasn't that valuable of a skill set and it only costs like $5,000 or $10,000. So to the extent we have that money, we should just pay it. So I think there's been a decent amount of shiny balls for us, but every time, even though they're distracting in terms of like, I guess our thinking, I don't think we've ever really gotten way off track chasing one of these shiny balls.
Yeah. I know going back to like the 3D, like I thought that was a pretty good one. And those experiences, those like cringy like moments that you look back on, they're not cringy at the time, but like when you look back on it, you're like it's kind of cringy. For instance, like when you write something, maybe you wrote something in like high school or something like that, and you're like, oh man, this is awesome. This is like some of the best like prose or whatever that I've ever written in my entire life. And then now you kind of go back and you read it, you're like, oh, I can't even get through it. It's just so, I'm so embarrassed for myself. Uh, and I have a little bit of that with like the 3D printing because we were really into it. I remember like walking through Hyde Park to the Fab Lab, like knowing that we're going to print out this CAD and like we're going to, there were so many, we had so many like pie in the sky visions for 3D printing. So a lot of cringe moments looking back at it now. Um, and I think the one that really the shiny ball that at least I chased after really hard, and I'm still not off of, I just know that it's not right for us right now, is the foot scanning. And I thought that was like nail in the head because that was really like a central part, at least I felt, of the product offering because as we were doing a lot of different like feedback with parents, the main concern was like sizing and fit, like getting that right because parents are so concerned. And then we kind of like Kate and I have kind of like gone through similar cases of like making sure that the shoe actually fits. So getting that right, I thought was just so important to the point where foot scanning should be a part of like an initial like offering, but realizing that that may not be the case because getting the product right, and I think you did a pretty good job of like articulating some of the reasons why it's not something that we should be focused on at this moment, and that's what makes it so difficult. I mean, just the fact that it seems to be like such a useful part of the business model makes it such a shiny ball. Like it's just so hard not to kind of like get distracted by it. But yeah, I think we've done a good job of like being focused at this point. So yeah, that's a very good example of a shiny ball.
Then one of the things David was mentioning was that, he had people in his family who used to think weed was the devil, but now they're like, happy customers, or they're super supportive of him and what he's doing. So I might have asked you this before, but I'm curious whether it's family, friends, coworkers, whatever it is, how do people generally react when you tell them about what you're up to?
Well, it's definitely not seen as the same as weed. Like they're like, kid shoes and weed, that's where there's we talked about similarities. Well, there's a lot of divergence right there. Um, they're more or less like excited about it. They're excited about like, especially once you get an opportunity to talk about the product. And David even mentioned it when he was talking about his product, like he was talking about like what it does. And it seems like we're in a similar situation where it's just more than just a quick elevator pitch. You really have to explain it in order for people to get it. And once you do that, I think people naturally start seeing the value in it. And then there is where the excitement comes and like the support comes. I mean, they're already, for the most part, the people who know me are going to be supportive anyway, but they're a little bit more excited about it when they really understand the benefits that come out of this particular product. So um, we don't have as steep of a of a hurdle to get over in terms of like winning family and friends, because it's not anywhere near being a taboo product like THC has been, and it's coming out of that now, but like it's got a history of of being like illegal and then also now just kind of being taboo. So like I think vastly different in that regards, but very, very much, at least to my face, a lot of support. I don't know if your experience has been the same, but
Yeah, I would say it's similar with people who I already have a relationship with. It's very positive, and like you were saying, to an extent, they're just going to support you no matter what you do. Um, but if I meet like a random, like if I'm out with friends and then some friend of a friend asks me what I do for work, and then I have to start explaining basically what we're doing at Worldie, or if I meet any like random person and we start talking about it, I think there's generally a lot more skepticism and a lot more of and I mean, people are risk averse, right? So they're just kind of like, this something similar is already out there and you're competing against one of the most well-known and admired brands in the world. So basically, why are you doing that? And then also, you better have a really good plan if you want to take some market share from them. So I think there's definitely some people out there who think we're crazy, but I mean, I think all entrepreneurs are crazy to an extent because you know that the odds are stacked against you and you still decide to do it. So I don't think hearing people who are skeptical makes me any less or any more skeptical myself. We know it's going to be hard, and I don't necessarily need support or validation from strangers. But at the same time, like on the flip side, there's a lot of people who reach out to me either personally, like who know me, or on LinkedIn or whatever it is, after looking at some of our LinkedIn posts, our website, and they're kind of like, this is a really cool product. I was just looking for kids' shoes. I couldn't find anything like what you guys are doing. Seems like the perfect product. Let me know when it's available. I definitely want to buy it. So I think, there's definitely some validation that comes from that. And then the people who are not necessarily going to be our customers, or not, who don't believe in our idea, like to the extent they have something valuable to say, I listen to it. But beyond that, it's just like, this is what I'm working on and I don't really need your approval to go after it. So, I'll have a polite conversation with you, but I don't really value your opinion over mine because I know a lot more about it than you do.
yeah. No, I've definitely been on a couple of calls where we've experienced a fair amount of skepticism, and even from people who fall within that segment of friends and family. Some some phrases like, "Oh yeah, I'm just not, I just don't buy it, I just don't get it," or whatever. Even after we've had like that chance to really explain the value, so there is some of that out there, and most of it still I think about it from where they're coming from, and I think it comes from a good place. But like you were mentioning, They haven't had the chance to really dive into it like we have. So it's kind of hard for them to really grasp the bigger picture. And even out of those conversations, I think we kind of get an opportunity to really start, evaluating it even more, evaluating like our strategy even more, and uh, it helps us like refine our approach. So I feel like even those kind of like conversations that we have are net positives.
So this is a related question. If you knew someone, let's say you know them decently well, and they have some startup idea, they're going after it super hard, they explain it to you, and you legitimately think it's a dumb idea and they're going to fail, how would you approach that conversation? What would you say to them?
I think now, having been on this side of the table, I will approach it at a very different way. Um, I think I could still point out some areas of concern that I could have for that particular product or venture or idea without trying to demoralize them or prevent them from pursuing it, because I haven't done enough. More than likely, I wouldn't have done enough in that particular space to be an authority on that, nor do I really understand the market in the same way in which they potentially understand it. So telling them not to do something, I don't think is my place, but reminding them or perhaps being able to highlight things that they may or may not have considered could be something that's beneficial for them. Because I think that would be beneficial for me in the same situation. So I kind of like see myself in their spot and how I could use criticism to help, better my approach. And that's one of the ways, like being able to provide constructive criticism, I think is how I would kind of approach that conversation, while at the same time, depending on our relationship, being very supportive because I've been in that spot and knowing like, these are some things that you really need to consider. Um, my opinion on whether the success or failure doesn't matter. So that's not even something that I would like really bring up. It's more or less like these are some like other points that you really need to kind of like look at from my perspective, and um, and making sure that they have those ducks in a row going forward so that they can have a better chance of experiencing success. So I think there are ways to do it without saying like, "Hey, you need to choose a different like path, or you need to go down a different, stop what you're doing and do something else." So
Yeah, I agree. I don't really think it's would be our place to say to someone who's working on a business, you need to shut this thing down. I mean, if you're like an advisor and you see that the company is just burning cash and that there's really no way, basically no way for them to save the company, then I think that's different. But if someone is just at the beginning stages and they're working on an idea, I don't think that's your place. And the reason I asked is because I actually have a lot of people who, like over the last couple of years, I've probably had like 20, 25 people reach out to me and ask about um their idea to get my feedback, whether it's, friends from school, like, back home, people in college, people from grad school, people on LinkedIn. And the way that I think about it is I listen and then I try to think how I can help them. So if I feel like there's no market for it, or potentially there's no market for it, then I would just say to them, make sure you're doing a lot of customer research, make sure that there's actually people out there who would want this solution before you invest money in it. And then if it feels like there is a market, but they're not really a differentiated product at all, I would say make sure you really kind of look at these things like differentiation, stuff like value proposition, things like that. And then, hey, take a look at these companies that are already in your space and potentially talk to some, I know people in a lot of different industries at this point. So I'll be like, hey, I think you should talk to this person. I can make this introduction and then get their feedback. They know more about the industry, so they'll be able to give you more pointed feedback. So for me, it's like if I don't love the idea right away, it's more like how do I help them de-risk the startup and get information before they have to spend money, or how do I basically make connections to allow them to more easily get this thing off the ground, or to have that person be like, hey, this is not necessarily the best idea, or if you want to go after this space, you're probably gonna have to do it in a little bit different of a way. Because I think just in general, if you're an entrepreneur, you already have a lot of doubts, and then a lot of people out there are doubting you. So I think as entrepreneurs, we have to, support other potential entrepreneurs and encourage them to continue to look into these different ideas, because I mean, we've seen this ourselves. Like, if your first idea isn't perfect, you pivot. And if you really care about a target segment or problem, eventually you're probably going to find something that's worth going after. And if we listened to the first person who encouraged us to stop, then we would have stopped like 2 years ago.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think I saw like recently a LinkedIn post about like the audacity of an idea. Like the good ideas have a fair amount of audacity surrounding them. And if I were to hear something like, for instance, several years back, like Hoka's pitch, like if like the founders for whatever reason came to me and pitched their idea as to like what they were planning on doing within the shoe industry, there would be a fair amount of skepticism on my part. And I would think, like, I not necessarily say it to them, but I would think that that wouldn't have been a successful approach to like breaking into like the footwear industry and being successful. So I think that's why it's not our place, because you don't know. Like because you have like a vision of the world as it is, you don't really know where the world's going and how the market's going to change. So it's not on us or on an individual to say like that's a bad idea or that's not going to work, because unless like you kind of mentioned in terms of like there's really a lot of indicators out there, and even then you're just probably just kind of like, hey, you really need to think about this, you really need to think about XYZ, because there's you're bleeding cash at this moment and it does not appear to be any way out. Even then, like you kind of want to be very careful about it. But yeah, these ideas seem, very crazy, very wild at the moment. And then later on, when they actually execute upon them, you're like, wow, that was genius. That was smart. Like, and that's what you don't see. So
Yeah, that's a good point, because I remember when Facebook was kind of at its peak, and then there were a bunch of other technologies coming out. So I remember when Twitter started getting popular, I was like, that's just Facebook statuses and nothing else about Facebook. So like, why would that be successful? And then Instagram came out, and I was like, so basically a photo album? Like, no, that's not going to be successful. And then Snapchat came out, and I was like, so basically texting someone a photo, but then it deletes instead of keeping it. Like, no, that's not going to be successful at all. And all of those companies are, extremely successful. So I think basically having humility and being like, I don't know everything. So I'm not going to know whether something is going to be successful or not, but I can provide feedback as a potential consumer. And then also as a business person, I know some of the things that you might want to consider. So it's really getting things on the person's radar that they want to think about or consider, but not being like, oh, you've given me all the information I need to let you know that this is not going to be successful. So just shut down.
in a 30-minute conversation, I know
Yeah.
that this isn't going to work in the future. Like,
Yeah. Yep.
no, that's 100, man. I think that's really good. Another thing that David talked about was and we've talked about it a lot, was bootstrapping, but this is kind of like a chance to like, put our money where our mouth is or whatever. And he was given an opportunity to receive like 100K investment, and I believe he turned it down. And we kind of like ideated a little bit about like what would happen if we receive that same type of investment. But if it were to happen right now, knowing like all the plans that we have, if we were to receive 100K investment proposal, would you want to turn it down?
Um, so if you had asked me that question a year ago or 2 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to turn that down, because, bootstrapping is the way. Um, and the thing about bootstrapping is it's really hard, right? Like, it looks
Yeah.
like anyone who's kind of like looking from the outside, maybe not anyone, but a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, I'll just bootstrap. It's hard, but I'm willing to go a little bit slower and have almost 100% of the equity versus like 20% of the equity and just getting a lot more money in the door sooner. But the further along we get with this, the more I'm like, man, some money really would help us out. And this thing really is difficult. And we really haven't had to spend that much money yet. So I think spending a ton of your own money on the venture just adds another level of stress and pressure. So I would definitely be open to considering it, but it would really depend who it's coming from. So if it was coming from angels or one super angel, then I would be, I mean, it depends how much of the company they're getting, but I'd be very open to it, especially if we felt like they were the right partner. But if it was a VC and they were asking for like, I don't know, 10% of the company, then I would say no.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That's probably an unfair question because it's super broad without any kind of like specifics attached to it. So the terms would definitely matter. And the relationship, like heading into it, like at least like your understanding of the relationship would be very important. And I think about like our conversation back when we talked to Chip and about like his strategy, especially around like these consumer products and like being a super angel or whatnot. I think that type of dynamic lends itself or is more appealing than, like you mentioned, a VC. Um, so yeah, I think it would definitely be something worth considering, 100K investment proposal, given what we kind of want to accomplish. I would still potentially kind of want to hold off to after like some of our other strategies kind of have rolled out, like crowdfunding and maybe friends and family round or something like that, before like really like going hard towards like some one of those type of proposals. But yeah, it would be hard to kind of turn it down right now.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it sounds like a lot, but it's really not. Like you could easily just if you wanted to rebrand, if you wanted to get the website done by a really high level agency, you could easily spend that with one agency or two agencies. So it sounds like a lot, but then once you get into different things that you can do with it, it's like, yeah, maybe that helps give us a little bit more breathing room and not spend as much of our own money. But at the same time, it's not going to like massively change the upside or trajectory of the company. So it's almost like if we're going to raise, we might as well try to raise like a million or 2 million. And that's easy to say because maybe no one wants to give us that. But I think that 100K would almost be like, have to be, we really want this person involved in our venture, not just their money, because that money we could spend, in a few months or a year, whatever it is.
Yeah, or quickly on a on one product order, one round of
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
it could
Yeah.
be gone. So no, I 100% agree with that. Um, I know David mentioned a whole lot about being patient, and even when you asked him the question about like, okay, what maybe the question was about like what is something that he would have done differently or whatever it is. But I remember him answering like patience, like and I thought about like us, and I know we have done it very intentionally and we've been very like methodical, but do you think we're patient or is this just like a product of the environment that we're in?
I think we've been forced to be patient. So I think when we started out, we were probably pretty impatient because our timelines were super unrealistic. I think when we started in November 2021, and I think we were thinking by 2022 we would launch. Can't remember exactly. It was either 2022 or 2023, like summer.
Yeah.
And those dates have come and gone.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of other goals, like timeline goals that we missed. But as we get further and further along, I think we get more realistic with some of these goals. And to an extent, it's like some of this stuff is you try to push it along as quickly as you can, but it gets done when it gets done.
Yeah.
And if it's out of your control, it's kind of out of your control. So I think we've been forced to be patient. And by being forced to be patient, we became more patient. And I think moving forward, even if we could move things along super quickly, we wouldn't necessarily do that. So we wouldn't just bring a second product to the market just because we could do it super quickly. We would go through the same process of talking to consumers, testing, iterating, all that kind of stuff. So I think we are getting more and more patient, but at the same time, I think as an entrepreneur, you still do need that impatience just to add that sense of urgency and to move things along, to move your partners along, and to just get things done.
Yeah, that's right. I think we definitely started off with a fair amount of impatience. And as we've gotten a better understanding of this whole product development process, it has created opportunities for us to grow in the patience arena. And so I think that's what's kind of happened. And it actually kind of works out for us because we also have a bit of like, perfectionism. Like we want to make this thing right. We want to make it, I mean, not perfect, but I mean, we would like to get to perfect, but we would also want to make sure that this product is getting out there and it's the best representation of like our idea. So I think patience has definitely been something that we've kind of learned along the way regarding this particular endeavor. But I don't know if that was necessarily our thought process or our mindset at the onset. So yeah, I think we are becoming more patient, but we definitely weren't patient at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, when we first started, we were kind of like, after graduation, we might not have to take jobs, right? Like it was that slow process of realizing like, oh, we're gonna have to take a job just in case. And then like, oh, we're gonna actually have to work in these jobs. And then, oh, it might be a year or two in these jobs. So I think we've definitely got more patient over the years because we thought, I think it was like I said before, I think it was just unrealistic expectations. Like if you had asked us in 2021 where we would be now in January 2024, we'd probably be like, oh yeah, we've been selling for 6 months. We sold out of that first order. We're probably thinking about a second order. Nike's approached us for acquisition of, $1 billion. We turned that down, all that kind of stuff.
It's funny because it's true. Those I think we've even articulated those same like thankfully that stuff hasn't been recorded. So like no one
Yeah.
can go back and whatever. So yeah, I don't know. I agree with all that. Maybe the last question from me is something that we kind of ended on during our conversation with David, and it was about the transition from being a founder-led company to being a product-led company. So, when do you think, or when should this happen? Because obviously, right now, we don't necessarily have a product that we could put at the forefront and build around it to where like the content is surrounding the founders. But when does that transition? I know David kind of mentioned that once you start like selling, once it starts hitting like maybe not that plateau, but like once it starts hitting that period where it seems natural to start like stepping back as being the face of the brand and or more or less letting the product speak for itself. Um, is a good spot for that transition to happen. But is that the same in your mind? Like, is that where it should start happening, or should it start happening sooner?
I think it's hard to pinpoint exactly when it should happen, but I think at the same time, it'll feel like a natural progression. So for us right now, we're more founder led just because our product, for a long time, we didn't even have anything to show, right? So it's hard to be product led with no product. Like we wouldn't want to go out with some 2D sketch and be like, hey guys, this is worldie,
Emperor's new clothes, like
yeah, this is the product you can expect. Like people wouldn't be too interested in that. So I think we've had to build our personal brands and talk about our values, our mission, just so that we get our company on people's radar. And then, I mean, when we post updates about the product and actually show it, people are super excited. And I think once we launch, there will be a lot of excitement around it too. And I think once we start having word of mouth reviews maybe some UGC. Once we start having these events, I think it'll be a lot easier to start making that transition from founder led to product led. But I think it's actually going to be the first stage is founder led, and then it's founder plus product. So this is the product. It looks good, but why is this different? Why should I buy from these guys? And then those people look into us, the founders. And then once we really have recognition, brand recognition, once people trust the product, there's a lot of people talking about it positively, then I think we make that transition to product led. So I think it'll be a transition period of maybe a couple of years. And I think it's important to have both. Like even now with Nike, Shoe Dog is a very popular book, and a lot of people after they read it, they're kind of like, oh, I feel a stronger connection to the Nike brand now. So I think always telling that founder story is going to be important to us. But once we start selling and we actually have a product that people really enjoy, that's when we start to focus more on the product than ourselves.
Yeah, no, I agree that the complete, quote unquote, complete transition will take a while. Um, but where it starts, uh, I think you're kind of spot on in terms of where it starts. For me, like I think it's in the same, that once you hit that same milestone when you start getting a bit more UGC that actually features the product and displaying the functionality of it is where we can start that transition period. Like it can start there, because we do want to see kids in the product, to see kids like actually uh, playing these different sports with the product on. So stepping back a little bit and allowing that to be highlighted, I think begins that transition. But I think you were also spot on with using that shoe dog example. You still want that founder story in there because that's that other sticky substance that creates that connection between the consumer and the brand. And it's that narrative that's super important. Nike has like a historian to make sure that that story doesn't get lost. They want to. That's how important it is. They have like you know individuals whose sole job is to make sure that they capture these moments because people care about it. People care about the story, even with these huge mega brands. People care about it, um, and we want to make sure that never gets lost. So, a complete transition, I don't think now that I've said all that ever happens because there's always going to be a founder part of it. But yeah, I think that it's always going to have some type of like um, element to where the founder story is going to be an important part of like the product or brand.
So I was thinking as you were talking, and I think the moment in my mind when that transition has happened is, so you can imagine someone from our target audience just standing alone in a room, right? And we have a finalized product, and then there's us standing there outside the room, and then there's some, let's say, worldie salesperson standing outside the room. When we're confident sending that person in the room with the product to explain it to the target customer with us kind of like standing outside and just watching, I think that's the point in time where we feel like we've gone from founder led to product led. Because right now we'd be like, no, we're not sending someone else in there. Like that's got to be us because they've got to hear it specifically from us. They got to hear about our backstory. Whereas if the product is leading, then anyone can go in there and make that sale. So you don't see um like Phil Knight in Nike stores selling because the product sells itself, where like a 16-year-old can be in there selling, right? So I think that's kind of the point in time where it goes from founder led to product led.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I agree with that.
Then last question I had is, because David is in a pretty interesting industry where there's certain aspects that are working, in his favor, and then other things that are working against him, like basically like regulation.
Yeah.
So some of it is loosening, some of it is still pretty strict. So what kind of industry trends are you seeing that are benefiting us and that are potentially hindering us?
One industry trend that I think is benefiting us is people are becoming more aware of the impacts of their consumption. So they're wanting things that are, you know, humanely produced. They're wanting sustainable products. They want low impact, environmental impact products. They care about where their money's going, and they realize that their consumption can have a detriment on the community, on the world in general. So I think that kind of trend, especially among millennials, bodes well for us because we want like a thoughtful consumer. That's what we were looking for. Someone who thinks about their purchase in more than just a myopic way, like being able to kind of think about like the longer lasting impacts of what their consumption brings. So that type of trend really really is something that we can kind of like capture and use for our benefit, because we're obviously creating a shoe that cuts down on the amount of shoes that you have to consume, and that in and of itself creates a positive environmental impact just off of that alone, and not even concerning like the production or the materials being used. So I think that is a trend that kind of is very useful for us. um, and then maybe a trend that doesn't bode well for us. Um, I think we've already talked about it a little bit, and and I don't know if it's something that's new. It's probably going around for a long time, but because of like technology, we're able to it's kind of exacerbated because you kind of see it a little bit more. Is the virality, the trends that are just fleeting. People kind of hop on it for a moment. We talked about it with Stanley's, but then they're potentially gone because before Stanley, there was like Hydro Flask. There was something else, there was always something beforehand, and people just kind of like keep jumping to it. And that type of like uh that ADD amongst consumers is very like hard to get people to concentrate and focus, people collectively to focus on something or one thing. So that makes it very difficult for us because we're always going to have to be imaginative. And that's not terribly bad, but like that makes it much more difficult to have a successful brand, because you're going to have to think of different ways to get the consumer or keep the consumer focused, because they're going to want to hop around a lot because there's so many, and we've already talked about it too in this conversation, so many like shiny balls in a different way, but we talked about it. But like there's so many things out there that will distract them. um uh you've got competitors who are going to be building things that will distract them and will sound good because the marketing these days it's really on point. So I think that's like one of the trends that it's not going to be very helpful um for us. But yeah, I don't know. Those are the two things that I have.
Yeah, sustainability is definitely one of the ones that I was going to mention. Another one that I've heard from a lot of parents is that there's just quality issues with a lot of shoes these days. So even with bigger brands, they do make quality shoes, but you don't necessarily know which shoe is going to be quality unless you spend like $100 or $80, whatever it is on a kid's shoe. So I've heard a lot of parents be like, I bought this shoe 2 weeks ago and it's already wearing out, or my kid's toes are already poking through the front, things like that. So I think if we can get something that's very high quality and it's consistent across all of our products, and that's definitely gonna help us. I think also just in general, this is not necessarily just footwear, but people are a bit tired of bigger brands and they want something that's a little bit more human. So this goes back to our conversation around being a founder-led company. To the extent that we can humanize our brand and show people that we actually care, that we're not just putting these platitudes out there, then I think that's also going to be beneficial for us. And then this is both a good thing and a bad thing. There's been a lot of shoe companies recently that have, some of them have been successful, right? So we talked about Hoka, there's On, Allbirds was successful for a long time, but then that gets into some of the downside, right? Like there's a lot of these direct to consumer companies that were um successful at the outset, but then now we're realizing that they weren't good investments, and now VCs are not as interested in consumer. And so that's like a big failure story, I guess you could say, hanging over our head. If we try to go out and raise, people will say, well, what's to stop you guys from being the next Allbirds? And then there's another company that was started in basically the same space, like a kid's athletic shoe designed specifically for kids, and they had to shut down too. So I think those two companies, people are gonna, if they do research, they're gonna see those and say, how are you guys different? Or maybe they don't even make an offer because they say these companies are pretty good comps and they failed. So I don't see why these guys who are outsiders are going to succeed.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And um I think that kind of like goes in hand with the approach to consumer goods, to this type of product, and how it is different than tech. We have to do a lot more proving. Like I think that's something that we've already kind of discussed, that we're going to have to go out and do a lot on our own before we start bringing in investors when we want to scale, like these large institutional investors. Even if that's like something that we end up doing, um, it's going to take a lot more of proof for them because of what you've just mentioned. These, I won't say that they're like absolute failures, but these mishaps that have happened with these larger brands, specifically in our industry.
Yep. That's all I had in terms of questions. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. And like you were saying, kids products and THC, there's not exactly a lot of overlap right away, but it was really interesting to hear a story and kind of reflect on how that applies to our business.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said at the beginning, it was like and I feel like even the listener will probably be like, where are they going with this? Like, how is this gonna like how are they gonna tie this into their own narrative? So I thought it was really good hearing from David. Um, Contrary to popular belief, there are similarities between uh cannabis or hemp derived products and kid shoes, and I think we did a pretty good job of explaining that in this conversation. So looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, me too. Should be fun.
Should be. All right, man. Well, that's all I got too. So
Me too. Well, I'll talk to you later.
sounds good, man. Later.
Bye.